Hello and welcome to another episode of Metal Effort. My name's Nehemiah, and today we're going to be looking at this piece of metal, the LionSteel Rok. This is a brand new knife coming out of LionSteel. I have not had experience with a LionSteel product, and I saw kind of what this knife was doing, watched a few videos from like blade shows and stuff. People have been waiting for this knife for a long time, and it seems to be some innovative things that are going on, and you know me, I like innovation. I like seeing new things. And so I think it was worth taking a look at this knife. Before we get too far into it, let's do our size comparison. I've got the standard PM2 from Spyderco, as well as the Para 3. This is a very medium knife. Blade length is just a hair under 3.5. We can measure here. It's about like 3.4-ish. Cutting edge is more like 3.25, maybe a little bit more than that. It's a good size. I like different size knives for different reasons, and this one seemed like kind of be a every person knife where if you have small hands or big hands, you still might be able to make this work. And so good size. We could do some other size comparisons just to give us an idea. I think this is another perfectly medium-sized blade here. This is the Mass Drop Keen, right in that wheelhouse as far as like size and weight. What else do we have? Maybe Spidey Chef. It's a good comparison to size. Right around that same, just under 3.5, somewhere between that and 3.25. So I think that's enough. And then we will weigh this sucker. We've got a lot of titanium on this one. 5.62 ounces. 5.62 ounces. Keep that in your noggin. That might be relevant for later. And just to note before we dive into the dent, there are different versions of this knife. They have three different ones. There's M390, which this is. And then they have aluminum, which this is the titanium one. The aluminum one is, I don't know, $220, $230, depending if you get the DLC coated blade. And then they have a Damascus steel, not Damasteel, but Damascus steel with a titanium frame and a couple of different color options. That's in the $470 range. This knife that I'm reviewing is just the new titanium with the M3 blade. This is coming in around $360. So with that out of the way, let's jump into our dent. The decent, the excellent, the nitpicks, and the terrible of this piece of metal. In the decent, let's talk about this blade. I do like this blade shape. You got some flat, some belly, some point. You have these two big top swedges. And I think this is a very practical blade shape. It kind of vaguely reminds me of the Koenig Arius in blade shape. Equal percentage of like flats, belly, tip, kind of a swedge thing with a drop point going on. Very, very similar blades. This is a little bit longer. This is a full 3.5 inch, but still in the same wheelhouse. I think this blade is probably the closest thing in shape on a knife that I've experienced or handled. So I like that shape. It's a good shape. It's very practical, very tall grind, which this knife needs. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The swedge is also kind of a nice place to put the billboarding. So you've got LionSteel, Italy, you've got Moletta, M390, and I prefer clean blades, but this could be a lot worse. If you give a practical place, a design aesthetic where you can put the billboarding, I think that classes it up a bit. It doesn't make it so like tacked on. This seems like they had an idea of where they wanted to put the billboarding when they designed the knife and the blade shape. And so I kind of give this a pass. This is going to be my decent section instead of my nitpick section like it normally is, because I think this is fine. This is good. The actual cutting path, this is coming up and over that. Usually when you're cutting into things, it's not that big of a deal. You're not getting any friction from it. It's not, such an eyesore. So I get a pass on this knife, and that's a good thing. The jimping is, just barely good. It's just barely kind of limping over the line here. It's fairly large kind of distance in between each individual jimp, but it is, just enough to where it can hang on and it does the job. I could do with maybe one more jimp. And I don't know. I've definitely seen better. I've seen worse. But this is doing something without digesting my finger. So I'll give it a pass. Another interesting thing about this knife that I didn't really notice them kind of drumming up in the marketing of this, but this is effectively an integral knife. You have one solid chunk of titanium that they have milled everything out of. This isn't just a really well hidden seam. This is in fact one piece. And so, for the cost, especially on the aluminum ones, you're getting a integral knife for $220. That's pretty competitive. You're hard pressed to find machine work like this for that price range. And another thing to note is usually one of the downsides to an integral knife is the weight ratio is often much worse than another knife, because in another knife I can take the time to skeletonize the frame underneath, or if it's a full slab of titanium, but I get two sandwiches to screw together, you can mill out those titanium slabs before you put the knife together. But when you're machining from one chunk, the machines can't get in there to do any kind of machine work to lighten up the load. So this is kind of an interesting thing. What they've done is effectively make it a open back or partially open back integral, which is kind of weird, but is also helping with weight reduction. Now, mind you, this is not a light knife, but I just want to point out the fact that it could have been a lot worse if this was just one solid piece. This sucker would probably creep over the 6-ounce mark, kind of like the Riot Jack that I reviewed. It's just, they tend to be big, heavy knives. On the other hand, milling it out this much, and now you're kind of taking away what makes integral knives so special is just one solid piece, and just the simplicity of that. So I think there's a trade-off, but this is definitely unique. You don't see this combination of such big milling on the backspacer area in combination with the integral knife. So maybe you like this, maybe you don't, but it is, you must admit, unique. One of the other problems that a lot of knife makers who make integral knives that they have to figure out how to overcome is, how do you get the stop pin in? And so you look at like a Peter Rosenti knife, and you'll see on most of them, he'll have a stop pin up here usually, and you can actually see where he drilled a hole through, both sides of the scale, and then inserted a stop pin so the knife can actually lock up. And then, sometimes he tries to hide it to make it the exact same color and grind. Sometimes it's obviously a different color, and you're just kind of owning the design aesthetic of there being a stop pin. And so you notice from this side we don't see anything like that. So where's the stop pin? And this is kind of a clever bit of engineering. What you've done, and you can kind of see it in between here, the stop pin is actually halfway. It locks up here inside the knife instead of up here like most knives do. And then what they've done is they've inserted that stop pin underneath the asymmetrical, non-free spinning pivot. So you unscrew this, you push the pivot through, this kind of pulls out, and you'll see that they've put the stop pin just underneath the screw head. And so I think that's a really clever way to kind of handle the whole stop pin on an integral problem. And then as far as I can tell, having the stop pin here instead of, up higher on the knife like it usually is, it's rock solid. I don't think that leverage is working against you too badly. I don't think like this is a critical flaw of the knife. I mean, this thing is really, really solidly put together in terms of lockup and just, no blade play whatsoever in any direction. So I think this is good. It definitely gets a thumbs up for me, just for pure ingenuity and functionality. Next thing we want to talk about is probably the single biggest bit of innovation on this knife, and that's the clip. So when the knife is out of your pocket, the clip is actually recessed into the knife. So this is kind of its like trick up its sleeve. If I want to put it in my pocket, I'm kind of doing like a pincher grip, 2 fingers and a thumb, and I can push this button, grabbing onto the other side of the knife, and lift that clip up and then slide it into my pocket. So, okay, in theory, on paper, this is interesting. How does it actually play out? And so I'm happy to report some of it is good, and that's why I'm talking about it in the good section, the decent section. Some of it is not so great, and I'll elaborate when I get to the nitpick section. But for the decent part, this works. Usually you're gripping your knife pretty close to this type of grip anyway. If I've got another knife that has a clip, I'm usually sticking it in with those same 3 fingers. Sometimes I'll do it with 2, but usually to kind of direct traffic into navigating into the pocket, I'll do 3. I have a little bit more control with the pincer grip. And so given that, that's a natural thing to do, and there's plenty of clearance on either side of this clip, I didn't find this to be a problem. And there is a spring inside here that's kind of pinching it tight. So you hold it open, you slip it into your pocket, and then you let go, and your pants are kind of pinched on to the clip. So, or rather the clip is pinched onto your pants. It works. It definitely stays in your pocket just fine, and you can get it in. It's not too much of a frustration. I was a little worried that, you're messing and finicking with your knife, just trying to get it into your pocket could be a little bit annoying, but really it's not that different. You grip it a little bit and boom, usually you can get it on the first try. And because you're not pushing material past like a contact point right there, I think in a lot of ways this actually can get into your pocket easier than a lot of clips. So for now, that aspect of the clip is good. We'll talk more about some of the disadvantages when we get to it. Now, another thing I want to mention is this kind of over travel stop. This over travel stop, I thought, for the first day, I had this for like a day, and I was like, man, this is just a really overly decorative screw / over travel stop. Like, what is going on here? And realize that there's this little kind of hump right here that is actually to give you purchase to move this back and forth. And I was like, okay, what is this doing? And sure enough, I figured it out because, as dumb as I am, I eventually figured things out. It prevents your lock bar from disengaging. So by moving that over when the knife is open, I've essentially made this a fixed blade. I don't know how important this is in terms of practicality. The tension on this lock bar is substantial, and I don't think in a million years, unless you're like batoning with the knife or really doing something you probably shouldn't be doing anyway, I don't see this accidentally pushing over and disengaging. However, I think that this has to do with laws. I think there are some laws in some places in the world that maybe they care about this. I'm assuming. And, if you want that extra little bit of security to know that no matter what, this is not disengaging if you move that over, then, it doesn't hurt the knife for it to be there. It's not like it's sticking up. It's not, it looks a little complicated, but it's there's no sharp parts really that I would warn you about. It's fine. I don't think it's hurting you in any way. You probably will never use it, or need to use it rather. Moving on with this theme of being legal in many different places around the world, this flipper tab is actually removable. So you can see right here, there's a little torque screw here, and you can just unscrew it and disengage, take off that flipper tab entirely. So again, I'm assuming this is for, laws where in order for you to have a pocket knife, you can't open it one-handed. As soon as you take this off, it turns into a two-handed knife. Now, the frustrating thing about this is there's nothing for you to really grab onto. So if you're a little wet or sweaty like I am now, I can't take the knife out. Like I can't get it out. There we go. So I would, if I were you, unless you're breaking the law, I'd probably leave the flipper tab on there because there's not really an easy way to open the knife otherwise. But if it's not hurting anything by it being there, I'm not too worried. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Give us options. That's okay. Last thing in the decent section I want to talk about is the milling on the titanium slabs here. So there's a ton of kind of visual design flair going on here that clearly a CNC machine milled into this. So you have like a line motif going this way, and then you have a star motif that goes onto the clip. And down here, you flip it over. It's kind of mirrored on this side. It's very aesthetically pleasing. And you could just tell that, a lot of work and time went into each one of these knives to mill out this much. And I like it. I think it gives it some distinctiveness to it. I think if this was just straight, flat titanium, this would be a much more boring knife. But this is good. It's nice. And I don't think it's too flashy. Obviously this is going to be subjective, but I think it's tasteful, and I think it's good, and I like it. I'm putting it in my decent section. Now we can move on into the excellent. And I've actually got 3 excellent things here. First thing is the ergonomics. And this is kind of the whole point behind the clip recessing into the knife, is that when you're gripping it, that clip is not in the way. Now, that's not strictly saying that every knife that doesn't have a clip would be more ergonomic. That really depends on the knife. If the knife is too short this way or too thin this way, then maybe the clip not being there makes it feel a little bit too empty in your hand, and having the clip raised up can actually fill that gap. This knife is big enough, tall enough, and wide enough that that's definitely not a negative to have the clip recessed. And it actually fills the hand perfectly, and there is absolutely 0 hot spots on this knife. And so the end result is something that is extremely comfortable. I think my all-time favorite comfortable knife is still the Koenig Arius. And I think the pinch grip that we're getting right here is closer than right here. And so it's not my all-time favorite ergonomic knife, this, compared to the Koenig, but I think it's definitely a solid, 9.4 out of 10, where this might be like a 10 out of 10, honestly. So I think they achieved what they were going for in, making a comfortable knife in the hand. So I gotta give them props. They achieved, in regards to the ergonomics, what they set out to do. So I'll acknowledge that. Another thing I like that I just want to put in the excellent, just because I think it's so important. And this is something I want other knife makers and companies to hear if they stumble upon my modest little channel here. But I have to give LionSteel props for trying things. Having flipper tabs that are removable, having a way to lock in your bar. I don't think that's super innovative. I know that other people do that kind of thing. But, the clip really is something that I have personally never seen anywhere before. And I could see the very real benefits if they could get this to work correctly. And so, I haven't really we haven't gotten to the negative things on whether they actually achieved it. But I just want to stop and take a minute to just acknowledge that regardless of how it actually ended up, turning out, as far as is it making the knife better or worse overall, regardless of that outcome, they deserve props for trying. And I want more people to do new and innovative things. Somebody like Sneck Tan. Get out there, design a new lock, design, a new detent system, design a new clip system, do something. Make the industry better and take your creativity and improve the world in some way. And they tried to do that, and that is an honorable thing. And I acknowledge it. Last excellent thing is simply the value on specifically the aluminum version of this knife. I split the difference here, and I got the titanium for $360. Didn't spring for the Damascus steel. But the aluminum one, I think, really could be something special for certain people at that price point. Getting that integral knife with M390, just on those two things alone, as long as the knife itself is competent, I think you would at least want to consider that knife for $220. So that's in my excellent. This actual knife for $360 to get titanium instead of aluminum, I feel like that robs the knife of any kind of value or recommendation. So take this with a very big asterisk. Only 2 of the 3 models do I actually recommend because of the price, cost benefit analysis ratio. But it's there for the aluminum one, and I do want to let you know that is something that you might want to consider if you like everything about this knife. I would, however, continue watching to make sure you know what the negatives are. And with that, we'll jump into our nitpicks. First nitpick is just the difficulty in taking this apart and servicing it. Now, I will say taking this knife apart is probably easier than a lot of integral handle knives. And so it's not in the terrible section, I'll say. Normal screw, non-free spinning pivot on this side. So it's very easy to just unscrew this. You can push your pivot through and then just take the guts of the knife out. And so this is bearings, and then there's a couple washers in there. There's no track for the washers. The washers are just kind of pushed up against the titanium like it's a completely flat slab of titanium. You can see the washers in there. And then the bearings are on top of the washers. So the taking it apart is actually not that hard at all. Putting it back together is the difficult part, because you have to sandwich everything together. You have to push those washers into place. And I feel like, half of the lubrication that I put into the knife ended up not being anywhere near the pivot area by the time I got everything into there. The action was, improved by taking it apart, cleaning it, and putting more lube in there. But still, I felt like such a hassle that I really hope I don't have to get into this knife again. It's not something I look forward to. Next thing, on a related note, when I got this knife, the action was really, really gritty. And so that's what compelled me to take apart an integral knife. And sure enough, it was really dirty on the inside. So I don't know, what to make of that. Are all of them gritty? Maybe, could be. I'm only judging this knife right now, but you should know that it might be dirty when you get yours. Good news is the action did improve after I cleaned everything out. So, whatever, just something I'll mention. Next thing is the fact that my knife basically came dull. It was, like, it could cut you, I suppose, if you tried hard enough. But I was having problems just normal paper. Like, I couldn't do one clean swipe through paper out of the box. Even after stropping. I stropped it. I was like, maybe there's just some burr on there or something. But no, it was just not done right or not up to a high enough grade. I don't know what was going on, but it was not sharp in the slightest. So you see here, this is a mirror edge that I put onto the knife, and I'm happy to report that the actual grind lines and angles and everything like that were pretty good. So it's not like they botched the grind. It was just not particularly sharp. So for somebody like me that has a whole system and a bunch of diamond plates that I can get it up to a nice sharpness, that could be a major issue if you don't have those things. So this is, somewhere in between nitpick to just downright terrible if you, are pretty hard and set on getting a knife from the factory sharp. You might not be able to count on this coming sharp to you. Next thing is the blade. Now, I like the blade shape, like I mentioned, but this sucker is pretty thick. So we'll get some objective measurements here. So we're looking 0.178 that is one thick blade. I mean, we're comparing this to like, PM2. Let's do the very thickest part. I mean, 0.143, and this is considered a thick knife. So, not surprisingly, this is not the best cutter. Something like the Conagarius is a very, tall blade and is even pretty thick, right here, especially because it kind of like tapers down. But the advantage of this is it's extremely high and it's a hollow grind. But this is not a hollow grind from what I can tell. So, this can cut through stuff like butter, but the cutting power, if you're really going deep into something, this is just too thick. And I don't think they arbitrarily made this blade this thick. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. I think what's happened is the mechanism, the spring and the whole thing that's going on in the clip, I think this took a certain amount of thickness for them to get this to work correctly, right? So if they had, our handle has to be this thick and we can't really change it, if that's like their parameters, then when you go down here and it's like, well, we don't want our knife to be like super duper thick on each side of the scale and have this little thin little blade sticking out. So they tried to like even it up, take the total thickness of the knife and distributed it evenly among both sides of the scales added up compared to the thickness of the blade. And so I think they made the blade a lot thicker than you would normally want on a knife like this just to accommodate that clip. Now this is totally, circumstantial evidence. I'm inferring what's happened. I don't know if that was actually their decision process or how we ended up with this gigantic thick blade. But regardless, it's not a good cutter. And so the initial cut is fine, especially after I sharpened it. I can cut through paper okay. But, if I'm going to slice open an apple or something, this feels like I do need to baton it to even get it through. It's prying the apple apart instead of cutting it. Now, we weighed the knife at the beginning of the video, and this is over 5 ounces. I feel like that's the magical weight that, after 5 ounces, it's not something I can really consider as a good EDC option. And we're not just barely at 5 ounces. We're well over 5.5. For a 3.4-ish inch blade, I think that's pretty bad. And we discussed why, and a lot of it has to do with the integral knife, but also accommodating this gigantic thick blade, and it just kind of all adds up, and the knife is not really a featherweight in any regard. And so it's better than, like the Riot Jack that was like 7 something ounces. Like that sucker was a beast, but I don't know. It's not terrible. It is subjective. Some people like a heavier, bigger, beefier knife, but it's definitely more substantial than you would realize. As soon as you pick it up and hold it, you're like, whoa, this is a solid piece of metal and titanium. And to wrap up the nitpick section, I want to talk about this clip. So getting it into your pocket, fine. Getting it out, however, is a pain in the neck. It kind of reminded me of like a Chinese finger trap, where like the harder you pull, the tighter it gets. If you don't take the knife out exactly how you put it in with this like pincer grip, and you instead just try to grab on to the knife like you normally would, if I've got like a PM2 or whatever in my pocket, I'm just going to grab this and yank, right? But here you can't really do that, because when you're grabbing this, you're pinching it down even tighter onto your pocket. And so it won't come out. So you have to pinch it and then release it. That's really the only way that you can get this out of your knife without really being frustrated. So, getting it into your pocket, I would say, is easier than average, but getting it out of your pocket is probably the worst of any knife I've ever owned. And so I feel like that might rob the knife of the innovation that, they tried to do. It ended up failing, in my estimation, but I don't want them to stop, or anybody else to stop trying. So, people make comfortable ergonomic knives with clips all the time. So maybe, there's something in between having a recessed clip that maybe, stays clicked out or something like that until you take it out and push a button or move a lever, and then it pops back in. That way, when it goes into my pocket, I can maybe let it clamp down and then save it there. So it's like it's got tension, so it's not going to fly out of my pocket, but it's not so much that I can't just pull the knife out. Like, if somebody can do something like that, I think we can get, our cake and eat it too. But as it stands, I think it's frustrating enough, heavy enough, that I don't really want to carry the knife. Now, let's move on to the terrible. The terrible, I have not talked about the action on this knife at all. And so I'm going to hit you with all three of my important aspects to good action. Important to me, I guess. I mean, probably important to most people, but it's not ubiquitous, I'm sure. So you have three elements, right? You've got what's the open like, what's the disengagement like, and then what's the drop shut like, what's the close like. Okay, so let's take this one at a time. Action. You have to go fast and hard to get the knife to even deploy. If I go slower, it's going to limp itself out. If I try to do a push button instead of a light switch, I cannot get it there. That is not engaged. Now it's engaged. So action is below average. I would say it's probably below average. You have to get used to it and do it exactly the right speed and intensity, and it barely comes out. All right, well, that's kind of disappointing, but I can get used to doing it the correct way. We get muscle memory down pretty quickly, and I can consistently open the knife once I get used to exactly how I need to do it, right? Okay, but the disengagement. So I've got plenty of room here. There's a cutout groove, finger groove, which, helps with the ergonomics and all that. So I can come in horizontally with my finger. And so everything up to this point is great. The problem is that there's so much tension, and I have to move that so far that it is a pain in the neck to actually disengage this. And it's just sharp enough. Like, if there wasn't so much pressure to get it off, because it's not, I wouldn't say it's lock stick, because it's not friction here that's slowing you down. It's just how much pressure is pushing against you this way. So I'm just bending that lock bar against that. And it is way too strong. Way too strong. And the problem is that even though this lock bar is pushing this way with tremendous amounts of force to the point where I can barely disengage the lock bar, the detent is still a wet noodle. And so I think this is a symptom of having the detent ball in the wrong place. If you move the detent ball around to a different place, I think the lockup wouldn't have to go so deep into the knife, and I don't think you would have to have so much pressure pushing against it if you just made that detent ball somewhere where it wasn't so far away from the edge of the lock bar. The further the detent ball goes this way, then the harder the lock bar has to push to have the same amount of detent strength. And so the problem is they just have it too far back. It's too far back, and it's too deep in. They needed to move it this way and or move it this way. And I think they would have been okay. And the reason they didn't do that is because this lock bar here is in the middle. And so that is internally limiting where you can have the detent rest hole for that detent ball to actually sit, right? I can't go deeper in because I have the track for the stop pin right there. So it's all internal, and I would take the knife to try to show you, but it's not worth it. So basically, the disengaging is sharp and painful and unenjoyable. And then, again, there's so much friction right here Like before it even gets to the detent ball getting onto the tang of the blade, that friction, you could see how much wear is right there just from so much, surface area that is flat and pushing up against that tang of the blade. And so this is going to slow you down tremendously from having good action on the out or on the close. So it's pretty garbage is basically what it ends up being. I can't shake the knife. It's going to pop open. Like I can shake vigorously and I have to do it just right to even get it to close. So I have to push the blade closed is really the most reliable way for me to get this sucker closed. It's really not enjoyable. So the open sucks, the disengagement sucks, the close sucks. It's terrible. Now, let's wrap everything we've talked about up into the conclusion. The conclusion is really hard. It's hard for me to deliver. If the knife just outright was garbage, if it just had terrible action, it's hard to get in and out of your pocket, and it was just like a bad knife, then I wouldn't really have to hem and haw about this. The problem is that it's not exactly a terrible knife. It is easy to get it in your pocket. It's just difficult to get it out. It's easy to take apart the knife. It's just difficult to put it together. It's ergonomic, but uncomfortable to actually use. So it's kind of this weird, like, push-pull knife to where I feel more sad about the knife not being a gem than I normally would. More often than not, if the knife isn't good, I'm just kind of disengaged with it. It's like, well, sorry, buddy, you're not a good knife. I don't like you. This is like, the girl you're smitten with, but is bad for you. So I like the innovation. I like the ergonomics. I like the blade shape. I don't like the blade thickness. I don't like how hard it is to get it out of my pocket. I don't like how much it costs, except for the aluminum one. There's just a lot of things that are pulling me in different directions, but there's no bones about it. I don't recommend this knife unless you don't care about action like I do. If you're not a fidget person and you like the innovation, you like the cost, analysis of a aluminum integral knife with M390 blade, and you don't mind a good thick blade stock, then maybe this is for you. I don't think it's a terrible knife for everyone, but there's definitely a lot going on here that is not desirable for most of us that are buying more than one knife to use and just be happy with. That's it, everybody. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good one.